So, welcome everyone. This is our second reading in a cycle of readings this fall. And I'd like to kind of set it up. I'm Elena Groff. I'm the camp director of the lesbian fiction Campfire. And I'm hosting today along with Gail Teller, who is also an admin in the group. There's Gail. And today, three of us are reading. We've got RJ Samuel, who will read first, Patty Spencer, who will read after her, and I'll read last. And I'm going to let each of these wonderful authors, all of whom have won awards of various kinds. Everyone who's reading today has won at least one Goldie Award. So these are some, high-powered authors that we're presenting today. And I'm going to let RJ introduce herself.
Okay. I hadn't actually done an intro for myself, but I'm RJ Samuel, and I've published 5 novels. They range from a medical thriller to literary fiction, and I live in Atlanta, just outside Atlanta, with a hell of a lot of cats because I am now going to call myself the owner of a cat sanctuary and not a crazy cat lady, and one little dog. So if you see any cats, they have a habit of walking over me while I'm doing things at the computer. So, did you want me to start? Okay, sorry. So I'm going to read first from a work in progress. Archer's Web is a political thriller about a hacker who's a modern-day digital Robin Hood who takes from the right wing to help the left wing. Maya Abram is an independent security consultant who is hired to assist Claire Leaford and the Castle security firm track down and stop Archer after what appears to be a political assassination in Georgia. I'm just going to read the italicized opening to 2 of the chapters that serve as an intro to the 2 main characters, Maya, who is described through the eyes of her sibling Ray, and Claire. These chapter intros are written in a different style to the rest of the book. Maya moves through the world like a shadow cast against the wall, eyes and ears open, watching, assessing, analyzing everything around her. She is the younger, yet she's always felt ageless to Ray. Older sometimes when the little frown on her forehead was set in place and her eyes dimmed with whatever responsibility had settled on her thin shoulders. Younger when the dimples dipped into her cheeks, almost involuntarily, yet wholeheartedly, the joy glistening in her eyes, the weight lifted off her brows, the simple yet utter glee in the march of ants across a room, her usual curiosity satisfied by Ray's explanation of the train mentality, the organized societal rituals of those little bodies. Ray told her if she rubbed a line in the floor between the ants, they would lose their way. Her testing finger checked out the story. Her spontaneous laugh turned to penitent, deeply felt empathy and guilt when the ants behind the invisible barrier milled around in confusion. She did not know how to correct her act of war, of subversion, the consequences of her tiny action having such a disproportionate effect made her question her every move from then on. She rushed out of the room before Ray could reassure her that the ants always forged towards the line, butted against it repeatedly, crawled alongside it, until they found the edge of the barrier, and they created a new path around it, following each other, until they met up with the ants in the original line, rejoining the family, the society, the tribe, in a long unbroken line of ants. Ray looks back at that moment and wishes they'd called her back into the room to see the repaired train. Every time they see her miss the connectedness of lines of people forging ahead in their teams. Ray looks back and realizes their little sister did not get to be a child for long enough. She tries so hard to stay in line, to belong, but her heart still sees the invisible line instead of the ways around it. Claire. John Little had loved Claire from the moment he first saw her, perched on the top of a balcony railing, balancing her frame, leaning dangerously into the wind. He had placed his glass quietly on the 3-legged table, spoken softly, nervous that his voice would push her over the edge. The world would be a lot darker if you were not in it, he said, and to this day he doesn't know where those words came from or why he felt the need to say them. She turned and he felt the sting of those blue eyes. He thought of the tiles of swimming pools, the infinity pools of his youth, the splendid Caribbean seas, all the shades he could imagine. And she grinned and said, "I'm not jumping, I'm flying. Nothing can make me give up, not even Professor Twindy and his code loops from hell." He heard his future in the cadence of her voice, and he did not care whether it was as her lover, her friend, or her subordinate. No matter what level he was on with her, he would be satisfied. And he had been satisfied to be her partner in business and her friend always. He had held her when she cried silent tears, never for a lover, but for a failure that she could not comprehend, or a missed opportunity that her drive could not accept as lost. Her tears never flowed. They were what he imagined in the sound she made when he hugged her. He held her for seconds, never longer than 20, the counts of his breath, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, and he didn't know why he did that, counted the moments with her where he felt he could protect her, this self-contained, razor-sharp woman who always protected them, led their charge into the male-dominated world of cybersecurity and made it her fiefdom. She made him look good, and the customers and the competitors thought it was John Little who was the brilliance behind Castle Security. Yes, he was brilliant, but in a twinkling star beside Halley's Comet Way, beside Claire Marion Leaford, he was the shuffling hobo in the alleyway who looks up at the moon and dreams of building rockets. I'm going to read from my 4th novel, A Place Somewhere, which is part of the IHS Reading Challenge for the week of October 21st to 25th. A Place Somewhere is a story of online dating and deception. Alex Hart is an Irish accountant who has been the victim of online deception, losing her home and job after moving to America to follow her dream of a life with a woman she thought she knew. Alex becomes an investigator, vowing to help clients who suspect their online relationships may not be valid. She responds to her mother's plea to return to Ireland to find out if the Galway songwriter musician Brianna, that her daughter Cynthia has fallen in love with, is real and truly in love with her daughter. Alex ends up staying at Brianna's house after an accident, and this excerpt describes when Alex collects Brianna's 6-year-old niece Sasha from her Irish dancing class as a favour to Brianna, and they all go to the burn. There was no one visible through the glass doors of the squat beige building. Alex pushed at one of the doors and it opened. She heard the faint strains of a jig coming down a corridor. The dance class was being held at the end of the corridor. Alex looked through the 2 narrow panes of glass into a room with a polished pine floor. There were 15 girls of various ages and sizes, all in grey and blue uniforms, except for Sasha, the smallest, who was wearing grey sweatpants and a pink sweater that matched her face. Alex grinned as she noticed one dark pink sock alternating with a light pink one as Sasha lifted her feet in time. Alex pressed her face against the glass. Brianna had been right. The music seemed to flow through Sasha's body and into her feet, which danced as if she had been born to fly that way. The class was split into groups, and Alex lost sight of Sasha as the waves of dancers practiced their steps. One of the older girls looked almost professional, her grace more assured, her special shoes tapping out the rhythm on the polished wood. A few people were arriving to pick up their children, and they waited in the corridor beside Alex. The class was coming to an end, and the girls seemed to be doing a last exercise as they moved en masse around the floor in a circle of straight backs and kicking legs. Sasha glided in time with the music, but with her shorter legs she ended up dancing out of the circle. Alex felt the looks and grins of the older girls as they spun away from Sasha. Sasha's face was set and determined. When the music ended, Sasha gathered her coat and knapsack and headed straight for the doors. She didn't react to seeing Alex there instead of Brianna. Alex said, "Hey, Sasha, Brianna had a problem with the Jeep. I'll take you to her now." Sasha nodded and said in a solemn voice, "That old banger is a beast." Alex grinned and took the knapsack off Sasha's shoulder. She helped Sasha into her coat, tucking the fluffy hood under wayward hair. They walked down the corridor. The excited chatter of the other girls flowed and ebbed as the door swung open and shut with each expelled child. Alex put the knapsack on the back seat of the rental car as Sasha climbed into the front seat. Alex typed in the address of Brianna's workplace into the GPS. So they meet with Brianna and decide to go to the burn, picking up Brianna's dog, Terror, on the way. Alex stared out of the passenger side window across grey rocks that stretched for miles into one flat, shapeless surface, the landscape of the moon, with only the occasional shape, the scent of movement. She felt the weight of her task press on her. Nothing felt right. She did not want to search anymore, did not want to uncover any secrets. The thought worried at her mind. She would become what she found, become like the women she uncovered, devoid of innocence and belief in its existence. Alex murmured, "It seems strange to see the sun shining on the moon. It's stunning, but also grey, isn't it? Does it not depress you sometimes, all this grey?" Brianna smiled. Her voice felt soft. Grey is a color and a feeling. I think it's a feeling of being unable to see clearly. It blankets, it hides, it blends into one vague mass. That's what I see on the drive down as I approach. But under the grey there are crevices, intricate and woven through stone. Alex felt herself shrinking back. She didn't want to see the crevices. The blanket sounded safer. Brianna pulled the car into a lay-by with the familiarity of practice. The grey spanned the yards from a stack of stones beside the road to the intense bleating of sea and horizon on their right. Brianna said, "You can look at the vastness and see only grey. Not until you go closer do you see the cracks, the fissures, the wounds." She put off the engine. "Come, when you step into it is when you see the depths, the mysteries." Alex took in a deep breath and straightened up. She had a job to do. She needed to control the emotions that were bubbling to the surface. Brianna got out and opened the back door. Sasha and Tara bounded from the car. Alex helped Brianna carry the blankets and the picnic that Maggie had packed for them of what seemed to be a three-course dinner as well as cheese, yogurts and dog treats. A little later, Sasha scraped the bottom of the tub of yogurt and licked the spoon. She sprawled out beside Alex on the rock. Alex pointed at the swallows that swarmed over the cliff. "Do you know what they're called when they fly together like that?" Sasha shook her head. "A flight of swallows." "Oh, that's cool." They watched as the birds flew at speed in one direction and just as quickly changed direction mid-flight. Alex said, "I remember sitting out in the back garden many years ago and watching a whole group of them flying above." Sasha asked, "How many of them?" "There were maybe 50 of them, I'm not sure, maybe 100. "I think 100. Alex smiled. They flew around really fast, all moving together, but I noticed this little one. It would be flying along happily, just keeping up, maybe a little to the side of the others, and just as it matched the speed of the others, the crowd would change direction. You could see the wee thing almost skidding to a halt and looking over its shoulder, and then it would try to catch up with the others, its little wings flapping like mad, but each time it caught up, the group would change direction again." "Oh no, the poor thing. Was it alone? Did it end up alone?" "No, but I think it probably always stayed at the edges." Sasha said, "I bet all the other birds were trying to get away because it wasn't fast enough." Alex said, "I think the little one was the cutest and the bravest of the lot. I wanted to be as brave as that little bird, to fly at the edges, not always in the middle of the group." There was silence for a moment, then Sasha said, "It's so busy in the middle. That's why I dance outside the circle." Alex said, "Maybe one day I'll be as brave." Alex smiled as she felt a little hand pat her arm. I have more, but I'm not sure if I've reached the end or... You muted?
Maybe we can ask if anybody has any questions so far. There are none in the chat, but does anybody have any questions for RJ so far?
Can I do a comment?
Sure.
I love the metaphors. I'm really bad at them, and I love your metaphors.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Oh, Carol Ann has a question.
Well, also the ants was wonderful. That was really, really inspired. And is the whole of that book you last read from set in the burn? That's a great setting.
A place somewhere is set in Ireland, in the US as well, and Cape Cod, and a little bit in Washington State, but mostly in Galway in Ireland, and they're very close to the Burren in County Clare, so they do take the trips down there. And Brianna's from Clare, so
Great locations.
yeah. Alex is from Dublin, so she does come from there and visit Brianna. So Ireland has always kind of formed a huge backdrop to my novels, and I've noticed that since I moved, I haven't been writing as much, so I don't know. It's like, I don't know if it's, I think when you're living somewhere and you absorb the place, I lived in Ireland for 30 years, and I absorbed it. I haven't yet absorbed as much of the US as I mean, I'm still writing and I'm still, well, I was writing and observing, but it hasn't really, I think, gotten into my bones in the same way yet.
I think we'll let Patty read, and then at the end, if we have time, we can have more group discussion. How's that sound? Is
That's
that good?
perfect. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm mute.
Okay. I'm going to try to read off a file that I have. You can still see me and everything. I've got my file up here. I also have it on paper because I'm that person. So the setup for this scene, this is from, I should show you the book that it's from. This is from The Hum of Bees, which is the first book in a series called the Prince Edward County series. It's actually a real place not too far from where I live that's kind of the Canadian equivalent of Martha's Vineyard. It's a county that's got vineyards and lavender fields and a lot of artists and historical towns, and a lot of people from the Toronto area and particularly use that kind of as a summer vacation destination. So in this book, it's a relationship between two people who are essentially running from society in one way or the other. Darcy Gordon is a master carpenter who has had an emotional crash and burn and returned to Prince Edward County to live as a recluse, or mostly a recluse, on her family's ancestral farm. Eugenia Gallant is a bishop who ignited a media storm when she uncovered sexual abuse at her cathedral in Victoria, British Columbia. And she's come for the summer to rent a cabin on Darcy's land just to get away from all the publicity that's come up from it. And she was forced to hand over her keys to the cathedral where she had just started working when she discovered the abuse, and told to think things over by her superior before the civil trial starts after Labor Day. So the scene that I'm going to read to you it's in chapter 18, at the end of chapter 18. It's well into the book. At this point, the characters have become physically intimate, but they both still have histories that they haven't shared with each other. Okay. On the night of Natalie's gathering, Eugenia stepped up to Darcy's veranda, outfitted in nice leather sandals, casual capris, and a rayon blouse that draped nicely over her breasts. She knocked. She wanted to check whether Darcy had changed her mind about staying home. A campfire by the water's edge with the gal pals sounded like fun. With all the difficult nights Darcy had been having lately, Eugenia still thought the outing might be a good distraction. In any event, she wanted to check on her before heading out. Her state of mind had been declining by the day. Darcy stepped out of the house onto the veranda. She was still in her work clothes, despite it being nearly 7 p.m. Her fringe of hair draped like a curtain over the right side of her somber face. She was holding a drill at her side, like she was some weary sheriff who had just shot up the place. I'm just heading out, Eugenia said. Just checking you haven't changed your mind. Nah, I'm good. You go ahead, have fun. I can drive you. What, in case I can't hold my liquor? Darcy lifted a corner of her mouth, but her smile aborted. A car was coming up the driveway. Eugenia turned, following the sound. A moment later, a gray Nissan came into the clearing. It had Washington, D.C. license plates. Darcy's eyes widened. She laid the drill on the little table by the door. Excuse me, she said, and eased past her. Eugenia followed her a little distance into the clearing and stopped, standing beside her own car, excuse me, which was already turned toward the road. The Nissan pulled alongside Darcy and the engine shut off. The door swung open, ding, ding, dinging, until the driver pulled the keys out of the ignition. Darcy tipped her head, peering inside. You okay? Darcy? The voice was plaintive. A hand came out, reaching for her. Darcy took it, first in one hand, then in both, and helped the woman to get out. She was shorter than Darcy, more rounded, and had collar-length light brown hair. Her face was somber and tired, a match for Darcy's of late. She stepped forward into Darcy's arms and buried her face in her shoulder. Darcy enveloped her in an embrace so full of cherishing and care that it took Eugenia's breath away. I didn't know you were coming, Darcy murmured, her head resting atop the other woman's, her lips pressing into her hair. She spoke so softly, so tenderly, that Eugenia scarcely caught the words. I couldn't sleep last night. Me neither. Darcy pulled back and looked down into the woman's eyes. Their gazes locked, and it seemed to Eugenia their eyes held an entire conversation before Darcy said, "Do you need to stay over?" The woman nodded. "If you can, I just..." Darcy caught her cheeks in her hands and held her face. "You can always come, Laura, always." Laura blinked, clearing tears from her eyes. She pulled back from Darcy and gave a start, noticing Eugenia for the first time. Darcy bit her lower lip. She took Laura's hand and brought her closer to Eugenia. "Laura, this is Eugenia. She's..." Darcy trailed off. Eugenia finally stepped forward, hand out. "I'm renting the cabin this summer." Laura extended her hand. "Hello, Eugenia. I'm Laura. I'm Darcy's wife." Chapter 19, Abiding. "Wife?" Heat blasted through Eugenia like a shock wave. "Wife!" She threw out a hand and braced herself against the hood of the car. "Technically," Darcy added. "Oh," Eugenia said, nodding as if she understood. "Eugenia," Darcy said. Eugenia turned to Laura. "Funny," she said. "Darcy and I have talked so much this summer, and it never came up that she was married." "Technically," Laura said. Eugenia broke the pause that followed by jingling her car keys. "Well, I'm just on my way out. It's been a pleasure to meet you." She shot Darcy a last look, then went around to her car. She got in, put on her seatbelt, turned the key, and drove away. Calling on every speck of self-control that she had cultivated over 30 years of working in a fraught environment, she did not spin the wheels or spit out gravel. She drove urbanely away, the very model of composure, leaving Darcy and Laura behind her. A kilometer up the road, well out of sight of Darcy's house, she pulled onto the shoulder, shaking so badly she couldn't drive. "Wife," she kept thinking. "Wife." She could scarcely breathe. "Wife." Her head was going to explode. Dear God in heaven, what have I done? She took time to settle, then drove on to Natalie's. When she came into the Lavender Farm parking lot, Natalie was just closing the visitor gate for the night. Eugenia parked. Coming to her window, Natalie tipped her head to look in at her, caught one glimpse, and said, "Uh-oh." Eugenia turned off the car and dropped the keys in her lap. "Darcy is married?" Natalie winced. "Technically." What in heaven's name does technically mean? It means they've been living in separate countries for 8.5 years, but they never canceled the paperwork. I take it Laura came up today? She must be on her way to see her family in Toronto. Eugenia rolled up the window, undid her seatbelt, and got out. Laura's staying over. Natalie shrugged. Well, it is the 11th. Eugenia missed the comment. You can call it technical if you want, Natalie Brandt, but the way they embraced each other, the way they looked into each other's eyes and had a long, unspoken conversation, that was not technically. Tears overflowed, running down her cheeks. I saw love, Natalie, deep, abiding love. And you love Darcy? Yes, I love her. She dashed at the wet trail on her cheek. I finally found the love of my life, and she's married, which she didn't bother to mention. Natalie stepped forward and embraced her. It's always awful when a marriage fails, but the real tragedy is when a marriage fails while the spouses still love each other. So Laura just drives up the road and Darcy holds her as if she's the most precious woman in the world while I stand by and watch. We became lovers, Nat. I'm sinking here. Oh my God, I'm sinking. You have to realize, Eugenia, Darcy isn't everyone. People look at her and it's like one of these is not like the others. But she looks at us and it's, what's wrong with this picture? Because when Darcy tells you that she loves you, it means something. It isn't a throwaway line. Hell or high water, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you drive up her road, she's going to open her heart for you the same way, no matter what happens between now and then. Don't you see? When she loves you, it's true and it's forever. It's not something she flicks off if it becomes difficult. She's not like the rest of us disposing of people. But that loyalty also means that when Laura drives up, Darcy loves her while you stand by and watch. Eugenia stood there, nostrils flaring with each breath, loving Darcy anyway, despite the omission, despite the technicality. Through her shock and upset, she was getting a taste of what Natalie meant when she talked about loving someone no matter what. Tomorrow, Natalie said, when you go back there. Tomorrow? No, tonight. No, tomorrow after you stay at my place overnight and we stay up for girl talk and you cool off. Tomorrow when you go back there, don't go at Darcy with guns blazing. There's more to this than meets the eye. Such as Eugenia made a rolling motion with her hand. Today's the 10th anniversary of their son's death. Drew? Yes. How did he die, Nat? You know I don't talk out of school, never have, Natalie said, but the truth is, I don't know much more than that. You're in uncharted territory now. No one's gotten this far with Darcy. We've all tried and failed to piece together that part of her story, but it's too tight inside her, which I suppose is partly why Laura is so important. She's the only other person who knows, the only one who understands how it feels to have lost this particular child. Eugenia looked at the horizon, steadying herself. Natalie, she finally said, do you have any idea what the press will do to me if this gets out? This is exactly the kind of dirt they love. Bishop gallant and torrid affair with married woman. But more than that, Nat, I never, never want to be that woman who undermines someone's marriage vows. You could have warned me. Hey, the last time I saw you two, Darcy was trying to glimpse your cleavage and you didn't even have your top button undone. When did you get to torrid? Natalie took Eugenia's elbow. Well, come along. There's beer in the cooler. That's your advice? There's beer in the cooler? For tonight, she said. Tomorrow you're going to invoke the Great Spirit to guide you and Darcy the rest of the way down the road together. Natalie gestured toward the shore, indicating where their friends were building the campfire. Eugenia shook her head, walking beside her. An adulteress, she mumbled. I'm an adulteress. God in heaven help me. And Darcy. Yes, Eugenia thought, and God help Darcy, whom I would also stand in the driveway for 10, 15, 20 years from now. And that's mine.
That's great. I really enjoyed this book and I recommend it to everyone. It was my introduction to Patty's work, and it had been recommended to me by some mutual friends. And if anyone hasn't read it, you should check it out. It would be great if authors can drop in the chat a link to the Amazon location for the book that you're reading from, or books, so that people can find it. And when I post, I'm going to post the recording in the Campfire. Also, if you could post that link in the comments so that people can find the book. Okay. So, any questions for Patty?
Just that it sounds beautiful. Really, really intriguing. Sounds like it's going to be deep.
Yeah, I wanted to write a story about grown-ups. People who weren't in baristas and pencil skirts and having stiletto heels, but real women who've had a real life, who understand the complications of love, and have the knowledge about how it works, other than just the romantic, easy peasy stuff. And I wanted to write a novel that wasn't just they meet, they fuck, they live happily ever after. It was just more like a real, what does love look like on the ground? What does love look like when it's complicated? What does love look like when you fail at it? What does it look like when life comes at you? How do you do that? We have so few models about how you do that. But I wanted to, my stories, my recent stories are really about how do you do that?
Actually, Carol, it was Nancy Manahan who recommended Patty's work to me. Um, any other comments? I have a question for you, Patty. The, the bishop in your story is of a denomination that allows, that must have been a little interesting of a needle to thread because clearly the Anglican Church of Canada doesn't allow gay marriage or sort of minimally approves of gays in the clergy. So, did you have an idea which denomination this could be?
Actually, I intentionally never named a denomination. And when her superior is referenced in this because there's a court case going on, and her superior's basically trying to save his ass until it's all over and throwing her under the bus. And I gave him a title that's not associated with any known religion, major religion, because my interest in this story and some other ones that I've written as well is to explore the issue as opposed to getting into a thicket where you're pointing fingers at people.
Mm-hmm.
Because my feeling is that we all screw up, we all make mistakes. Some of us are scurrilous, but that's not particular to one group. I think it's more a human trait that we have. It's the human condition. So I have the book that I'm working on now. It's a trilogy. It's called "I'll Get You Home," and it's a female combat photographer and a TV producer who go to a city under siege in the Balkans, and it's based on the siege of Sarajevo, which is politically incredibly difficult to write about. But I intentionally renamed the group so that and had people read it to be sure that there weren't surnames that were associated with particular groups, because I wanted to talk about the human condition as opposed to particular groups. So it's intentional obfuscation, the short answer.
Okay. That was a question. I had a house guest a couple of days ago who's married to a vicar in England, and she asked that question, and so I said I would ask. So here we are. Excuse me. Any other questions for Patty? Okay. Well, keep thinking about questions, and if we have some time at the end, then we can have a discussion about these various books. All right. So I was thinking about reading from my whip, but it's not really ready for prime time. So I decided not to do that. Instead, I picked a book that is set in a similar period of political unrest from my historical passing right series. It's called Lies of a Mission. And this is the book. And I began writing that series because I often wondered how the Germans came to the place they did with Hitler. And I remember speaking about it with my father, who was an officer in the German army during World War One, and he had his explanations, but they weren't very satisfying. So, when I was in graduate school, I wasn't studying history, but I started researching this period to see if I could figure out what was going on. In this book, there's a lot of discussion about how science is corrupted by politics, because the Germans had a policy called racial hygiene. And what that meant was they were going to purge the society of inferior races and all degenerates who were, everything from people who were born with club feet to mentally retarded people and other people who were ill. And they experimented early on with how to exterminate masses of people with people who were in hospitals, mental hospitals, and homes for the disabled. So this scene that I'm going to read is features two of the main characters. One is Margareta von Stalo, who is the a chief instructor. She's the manager of physician education at the Charité Hospital. She's a surgeon. And her young fellow, who's an American, Sarah Weber, who's come over to study at the Charité under Margareta. They've just gone through grand rounds. And if you can imagine, here are these mostly men, in fact, all men, who are trotting around following the chief doctor here. And they're wearing their, SS uniforms and their SA uniforms. Medicine was very popular with the Nazis because of these racial hygiene policies. So they have a discussion about this patient who has severe hernia, and he's a retarded man. And just so you know, I don't write politically correct books. And they're wondering why he should get medical services. After all, he's, handicapped. Why not save it for real Germans? So the chief doctor pulls him up short and defends her junior colleague. And this is where the scene begins. Heading back to my office, I became aware that someone in a hurry was following me. Frau Doctor, a moment, please. Sarah paused to compose herself after her dash down the hall before adding, "Thank you for defending me." "Defending you?" I asked, trying to keep my eyebrow from arching. A skeptical look is second nature to me and sometimes impossible to control. "I thought I was scolding your colleagues for their rudeness in front of a patient." "Well, you certainly pulled Powlin up short. And what you said is true. The patient has a right to treatment." "He does?" She opened her mouth to launch into a speech, but I held my finger to my lips to stop her. One could never be too careful. "Hold that thought," I whispered, opening the door to my office. Once the door was closed behind us, she began again. "That man desperately needs treatment. Why shouldn't he get it just because he's retarded?" "Dr. Weber, you put me in a difficult position." She frowned and gave me a long, pensive look. "Surely you don't agree with Nazi medical policies." I scrutinized her face, wondering how far to trust her. My instincts told me she was completely trustworthy, but these were strange times. "What I say must stay in this room for obvious reasons." "Of course." To answer your question, no, I don't agree with the concept of racial hygiene. However, I would be a hypocrite if I failed to admit that I have sterilized several severely retarded women based on the assumption they were incapable of caring for a child. You weren't alone in that. In an institutional setting where rape is a very real possibility or a hapless woman is easily seduced, it seemed a practical solution, but not a means for purifying the race. In such cases, it's reasonable and could be justified. Perhaps, however, I'm not so sure the end justifies the means. I invited her to sit. In fact, I am quite out of patience with this racial hygiene. That's a hard thing to say, by the way. This racial hygiene nonsense. It's spurious science, and yet I am forced to teach it. I think I must resign my post at the university. She looked stunned. "But you can't. You have to stand your ground and be a voice of reason. It could make a difference." I reminded myself that she was an American. Their devotion to what they call freedom of speech colored their perception of our politics. When her fellowship year was done, she could sail home to the States, and all of the challenges we Germans faced would be a fading memory. Perhaps it would make a difference to speak out, but my tenure would be rather short lived. Besides, the National Socialists would rather not have women in university posts. Female academics hardly fit the model of the submissive German woman. She looked bewildered. How could this happen? I came to Germany because it was so progressive. This is a modern country. Women had professional freedom here, while many American women were still struggling for recognition. Things are not always what they seem, I replied. And as you can see, conditions can deteriorate rapidly. She gazed at the orchids on my windowsill in a long moment of reflection. Finally, she said, "It's very discouraging to see you so negative. Are you really going to let them win so easily?" "No, but in times such as these, one must play one's hand very skillfully, staying one step ahead at every turn." "What will you do?" "As I've said, they will probably be glad to see me go. I am the last female on the Faculty of Medicine. I'm not the sort of docile woman the new order prefers." I smiled ironically at this understatement. Sarah continued to look grave. "Your resignation will make a statement," she finally said. "I hear Sauerbruck is moving on to a big government post, and you're in line to succeed him." "You mustn't believe every rumor, Dr. Weber," I replied mildly, although this rumor happened to be true. "Perhaps my resignation will signal a protest, but it will change nothing." She frowned as she thought about what I said. "I admire you for standing up for your principles, but it is a great loss to the Faculty of Medicine. Now there will be one less voice of sanity. Where will it end?" "My dear, I fear it will become much worse before we see the end of this madness, if we ever do." After Sarah left, her righteous indignation remained in the air like smoke. Her words gave me the impetus to take writing paper from my desk and compose my letter of resignation. Writing the actual letter proved to be difficult. It was an extraordinary honor to be a member of the medical faculty, especially for a woman, and I would truly miss teaching, although my role as the overseer of the rowdy junior surgical staff at the Charité would give me ample opportunity for instruction. What I found most challenging was coming up with a plausible reason for my departure. Being entirely candid, especially on paper, would be unwise. In the end, I defaulted to the usual excuse: family obligations. God knows they were legion. As I was sealing the envelope, I decided to deliver the letter in person. In order for my statement to have significance beyond releasing me from a position I now found untenable, I needed an opportunity to amplify its message. I called the office of the Dean of Medicine and set an appointment. I'd often walked the short distance from the Charité to the Humboldt University campus, distracted with thoughts of my impending lecture. This impromptu preparation had become something of a ritual. I seldom, if ever, wrote actual notes. As I entered the brick building where the offices of the Faculty of Medicine were housed, I realized that this might be my last visit to that place. I ascended the stairs with a heavy heart. In the great hall on the second floor, bronze busts of famous faculty lined the walls. Virchow, Koch, Behring, Ehrlich, and many other brilliant scientists and physicians, the heroes of the Charité and the University of Berlin. A few of the pedestals stood empty now, the nameplates removed, the busts taken away. Men once considered eminent were now discredited simply because they were Jews. Professor Aretz and I were old acquaintances and had developed a good rapport. He had begun his tenure as dean not long after I was granted the post of lecturer. He read the letter in my presence. As he read, his face grew pale. I had assumed that the resignation of a troublesome female academic would be welcomed. However, I had failed to consider how the departure of so eminent a medical person as myself would reflect on the university. Though I might be the wrong gender, I certainly had other criteria to recommend me, including credentials in two specialties, chiefs of published research, and university habilitation. Obviously, the dean was also very aware that my wealth had allowed me to be generous to the medical school. Eric stroked his salt and pepper beard and stared at the letter for some time. Finally, he looked up and gazed at me with a frown. I don't understand, Frau Doctor. Your lectures are very popular and you receive the highest ratings from your students. Clearly, you're a gifted teacher and you seem to genuinely enjoy teaching. It's not dislike for teaching, Aritz. It's reprehension for what I must teach. He looked alarmed to hear me speak so openly. In this room, for your ears only, I shall speak the truth. I cannot continue to teach lies to impressionable young minds, and this racial pseudoscience is most certainly a lie. At this, he looked even more distressed. Frau Doctor, we have already lost so many fine teachers. He paused for effect, rather than speak the reason aloud. They were Jews. We are already overburdened and badly in need of senior physicians like yourself to share the benefit of their experience. Someone should have thought of that sooner, before turning out so many of our colleagues and forcing the rest of us to give up our academic freedom. Aritz, you cannot tell me that we are still teaching science. He gazed at me for a long moment before shaking his head. He rose and offered his hand, which I took. There was much unexpressed emotion in his face, as I'm sure there was in mine. Thank you, Frau Doctor, for your contributions to the university, Art said. Your resignation is a profound loss. I nodded and showed myself out. Another glimpse of the empty pedestals in the hall confirmed that I had made the right decision. But what if I had depended upon my teaching position for my livelihood, to put a roof over our heads and food in our mouths? This perception made me grateful to have the means to afford principles, but also fearful for those who did not. And that's it. So there it is. It seemed more apt to read that than, especially in this political environment, and unfortunately, not only in this country, but around the world, we have science being questioned, and if somebody says we can control where the hurricanes hit, but and if you question, whether vaccines are being vaccinated is now an insult that you throw at people on Twitter. I noticed today. You must be vaccinated. So anyway, I see Carol Ann has a question.
Oh, not a question. I just want to say what an excellent series that is. I really admire it and enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Patty.
Yeah, I'm reading it right now. I just finished Lies of Omission, and I'm into Active Contrition. I'm really enjoying it. This is a very complex character in a really complex time in history. And this is not a character you've seen in any other book around it, certainly not in our community. So I'm really liking it. Thank you for writing it.
No, thank you for enjoying it.
I'm sure you're not getting rich. So.
Yeah, Margaret is a character you either love or hate, and it's very funny because when I published this book in 2018, the second book, which is really the first book, because I wrote a prequel afterwards to explain the character and the forces that had formed her. Um, but a lot of people misunderstood. They just thought she was another ice queen, the stock ice queens that we see in lesbian literature, or that she, was just had no boundaries because, now we put our psychological overlay on everything people think. But so I felt I had to explain how she had become the person she was and the times. That's the hardest thing about writing historical fiction. Anybody who's tried is trying to get into the ethos of the time and the language of the time, because the value system of that time is not our value system. And in some ways, I grew up, I was in college in the 1970s, and some of the values that we had then are no longer the values we have now. And you could argue whether the newer values are better or worse, but they're not the same, is for sure.
Well, I don't know if we're supposed to wait for turns, but I'll jump in. Diana Gabaldon also was excoriated because in her book Outlander, she had the male character beat up the female one. And of course, that doesn't fly very well now, but at the time it made sense, and it's later explained in the book. Well, one of the things I wanted to mention about your books I find really interesting, and I think it has to do with a certain sure-footedness that you have as a writer, and that is the challenge of creating a character who's not always likable. So that's something that I feel I haven't tried that because I know how dicey it is. It's a very thin line that you don't want to lose your reader by making your character, have traits that you rather they didn't, that were not heroic. But I think that writers who are able to pull that off, to walk that line, there's a certain it's a step up, it's a real step up to be able to do that. And I really appreciate that.
Well, one thing, I don't know who saw the movie Tar.
Yes.
I mean, that character doesn't have a whole lot of likable about her in any shape, but it's a great movie and a wonderful portrayal. But some people were so put off by the character traits, they just couldn't get into the movie, or they hated it, or they hated her. There was a lot of conversation around that.
Well, I think the thing is that the relationship, when you have in real life, when there's somebody does something that you don't like, you're still married to them. They're still your brother. They're still your neighbor, whatever. So you have to learn how to deal with it. But when you're watching a movie or you're reading a book, it's your choice to just put it down and walk away from it. So to keep that engagement, despite introducing elements that are sometimes difficult from the reader's perspective, that's a real art, right? To be able to do that.
Well, I think that number one, we're all flawed in some way. And if somebody is perfect from the beginning, there's no room for growth, and most character arcs that really work are those that show development. And it doesn't happen overnight. People make it seem like characters are transformed by a kind of Pauline conversion. They fall off the horse and see the light. And that's not how it is. That's not how it is in real life. Sometimes we have to do the same asshole thing over and over and over again until we get it, So.
I used to read, when I was reading, I used to read Minette Walters. Sorry about this dog. It's a British, I suppose, considered the queen of British crime fiction, and it was amazing for me. Her characters were always so unexpected, flawed. You never knew who was good or evil. They changed. I thought she was one of the best that I've read at kind of presenting characters as humans, and yeah, I learned from her a lot. But this noise that's going on here.
Yeah. She was a great writer also.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Her books were great. I love her.
What is that, a heater or something? Um,
Elena, you're muted.
oh, Elena, yes.
I muted you because of the noise. So, questions for anybody else? John.
Yeah. Are you going to be writing further books in the Passing Right series?
Oh, I started writing one. I started researching it, and I wrote about 30,000 words in a new book. And then the war in Ukraine started, and I just didn't have the stomach for all the violence and horror. I was also extraordinarily disturbed by reading the real story of the post-war era in Europe, where, basically people voluntarily continued the sort of ethnic cleansing that the Nazis had started. I mean, you had the Ukrainians throwing out the Germans, the Poles threw the Germans out of Eastern Europe. There were uprisings in Italy where they rose up against the aristocrats and killed them. And, villages just being exterminated. It just horrible stuff. And here we were, in the throes of the beginnings of the war in Ukraine, which has continued. And now, of course, we have the horrors in Gaza and Lebanon and other places in the world. So I just didn't have the spit for it. So I abandoned it and started writing another book in the Hobbes series. And the reason I did that was I published a book about a school shooting, and a month later, there was a mass shooting in Lewiston. So I felt I should really cover that. Most of my books are historical, even though they're about contemporary history. The Hobbes series is basically what's going on in the world. I mean, people have their lives and they go on about them, but they're impacted by real life. Any other questions?
Sorry, there was a question for Patty in the chat earlier.
Okay.
Why the Prince Edward County? I'd been wondering about the denomination when reading the book. Why the Prince Edward County?
Was that the question?
Yes, that's the question. Why the Prince Edward County?
Oh, because it's a real place. I think I mentioned earlier that Prince Edward County is sort of like Nantucket or like Provincetown, or it's a really pretty area. And I was just driving there with a friend of mine. I worked people from Kingston and people from Toronto just to get out. And I was just driving through and I thought, this is a perfect place for romance. This is a great place to write love stories. Whereas the city that I live in is, I think of more as a murder mystery story city. So it's like 90 minutes down the road the way I drive. The way other people drive, you can get there in an hour. But I go the scenic route and enjoy it. So it's a lot of people in Ontario really know about Prince Edward County and love going there. And it's kind of a destination. And it just came to me to do a set of stories there.
I just had a question for Patty as well. My dad was actually a priest. I was wondering, is there any reason you chose to write about church or a bishop?
I have to go back and look at my papers because I don't remember why I chose a bishop. I knew I wanted a recluse and I knew I wanted someone who was like the center of a media storm, but I didn't want a movie star and I didn't want a politician. And I thought, well, who else could be, the center of a big storm like that that would be an open lesbian? And I thought that would really crank it up if she was in a religious figure. So I was dating a minister at the time, but that had nothing to do with it. She's not even remotely like her. So
Well, but that's probably the seed of it.
it may have been that, the idea was there. Anyway, so part of the thing is also that when you write, when I write anyway, I have an idea at the beginning and I set myself down a path, and then sometimes I just cross the median. Once it starts to roll, it becomes its own thing. So I just go where it takes me. Whenever I've tried to force myself into an outline or something, it never works. I always have to unravel back to where the characters really wanted to do something else. So I just stop fighting it. I just start writing and see what happens.
She's a pantser.
I'm a pantser. Yeah.
I used to be such a
Used to be a what?
I used to be such a plotter. Now I just don't write. So. But yeah, I used to be Excel sheet plotter. But also like the creativity within that, the output's really cool.
I have some scenes that are incredible, like the sex scene between the first sex scene, no, the second sex scene in the Hum of Bees. I had a spreadsheet for that. I actually put it out for every beat, every emotional beat of it, and I had a column that was who was doing the action, what was the emotion happening in there, and what did it look like physically. So I have the ability to be a plotter, but I usually condense it down like right into the scene because I really I wanted to parse that out really particularly because it was a very key scene and it had to do with emotion, but in a sexual context. So sometimes I'm extremely Excel spreadsheet, and other times it's like, let's see what happens next.
I'm probably the opposite because I couldn't write a sex scene. So I have everything else plotted out. And then the only part in 5 books, there's one paragraph that I actually set as a contest for my readers to find out where is the only sex scene in my books, and it's that paragraph. It's based on a poem called I Can't Write a Sex Scene. But I'm amazed, and I think that's amazing that you did an Excel sheet of.
Yeah, and it's so counterintuitive for something so emotional to be so plotted. But
That's good.
I find that incredibly difficult to write, and the more of them I write, the more I'm aiming toward being more emotional, and then just having a touchdown to what's happening physically, because essentially sex is plumbing. It's slot A, tab B, or 2 slots or 2 tabs. Who cares, right? And
It's true.
you have a beginning, middle, and an end. And once you've written one physically, it's like I don't find them interesting. When I read, romances, some of the ones that don't really engage me as much, I just skip pages because I don't really care what their bodies are doing. I want to know what's happening in their hearts.
And I just reread the short story I wrote for the conference. It was a conference, short stories for being at a conference. And I realized there was actually like a little bit of a sexy part in it. And I was like, oh, I should read this tomorrow. And I'm like, no, I don't think I could. I don't think I would be able to.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And readers really expect a lot. With my very first novel, it was called Lie With Me, and it was it was actually pre-Regency, and it was a woman disguised as her brother falls in love with a penniless countess, and there's one sex scene in it, fully dressed, and one of my readers wrote, "I missed it." This is like, well, honey, they don't have to go to 5 pages. If you pay attention, you'll see that it's there. And then she was on me because she told me that lesbian fiction ended with a sex scene. And my feeling is, if I leave you in the bedroom with the women undressing each other and then I stop the book, you know what to do if you still got stray volts. It's up to you to take it the rest of the way. So it's very interesting.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed the readings, and I will post the recording soon. And authors, will you please drop the link to Amazon into the comments when
I dropped it into the chat as well.
okay, that would be great. In the comments when I post the reading. Okay. Thanks again. I've forgotten when our next reading is, but it's soon. And it's about 2 weeks, I think. And I think if this is good, and even though I introduced politics, we all need some relief from politics. I know, Patty, you're Canadian, so you're not feeling it like the rest of us are, but maybe you are because you're right over the border there.
The infection spreads. Let me tell you, the infection spreads.
Yeah.
Just take a look at
I have to
Alberta.
say, when I was in Ireland, that's all we watched for. I remember watching late, like early morning hours, because it affects everywhere.
It
And
does.
half the time we could not, well, the majority of the time we couldn't believe what was happening. So.
Okay. Thank you. We'll
Cute.
see you
Thank
soon.
you all.
Here.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.